time for Korea Book Club, our weekly segments where we explore the world of Korean literature and books, both in Korean and in English translations. Joining us this week, we have with us a cultural essayist, Colin Marshall, host of the podcast Colin 한국 and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. Colin, hello, it's great to see you again.
Glad to be back.
Okay, so Colin, as usual with you, we are looking at an as yet untranslated Korean book.
That's right.
And it is a recently published debut novel, or at least technically it's a debut novel.
Technically, yes, it is recently published and a debut, although its author, Yu, has also published two other novels. So how can this book, 레지스탕스, be both recently published and his debut? And that sounds a bit like a riddle, I know. What goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, that sort of thing. In fact, the answer is fairly straightforward. But nevertheless, it reveals something of the unconventional life this novel has had. EU first published it in 2018, 6 years ago. He put out another edition in 2020, and with this latest one, here in 2024, he's actually changed the text itself, revising and expanding it in a manner we usually only see in non-fiction books, not novels.
Yes, that is very interesting. So he has sort of rewritten his debut novel, or at least edited it. I mean, that's, I think, almost unheard of in Western literature, right?
But can't think of many examples.
Exactly, but I'm almost surprised it doesn't happen more often, like they do with films sometimes, the director's cut, as they call it.
Right.
I'm sure there are many other novelists who would look back at their earlier works and perhaps cringe and want to go back and revise some sections after they've gained some more perhaps experience and maturity in their writing. Do we know if that's why he went back to revise his debut novel?
He explains a few of the reasons in the book, but I think it's just one of those things he didn't want to be defined by this book as it was when he first put it out. So he took the opportunity to change it up a bit and to reflect his evolving views, you could say. And it also ties in with the themes of the book itself, doing this revision. The themes that make it feel in many ways like an old-fashioned Bildungsroman. And for those not familiar, that term refers to a genre of novel that traces the maturation, and broadly speaking, the education, of its protagonist, usually as that protagonist comes of age in the transition from childhood to adulthood. It means formation novel in German. And the Bildungsroman emerged in the 18th century with books like Tom Jones and Candide, but I would say its heyday came in the 19th century with Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, Sentimental Education, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and many more besides. The 20th century also offers quite a few well-known examples, like A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, and even Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood, which is a particularly famous novel here in Korea. But then, if we're talking about a Bildungsroman with a Korean readership, nothing compares to Hermann Hesse's Damien.
Okay, yes, this is a bit of a weird quirk in Korean. Damien will be a familiar title to pretty much any Korean listener out there, and to anyone who happens to live in Korea. They will surely have heard people talk about it, and it's weird because its popularity here is really disproportionate to its popularity in other countries, right?
I think so, more so than the US, more so than even Germany, from what I know. But I have an especially vivid memory from my very first years here in Korea of a lady who was cutting my hair while making reference to Abraxas, the Gnostic deity who encompasses all gods as well as all good and evil in the world. Now, that's hardly a typical subject of conversation in such a setting, in a hair salon. And at the time, I only understood faintly that Abraxas was somehow connected with Damien, this German novel from the 1910s that I inexplicably kept hearing brought up here in Korea. Later, when I sat down to write an essay about all this for the Los Angeles Review of Books, I found out that Damien is so widely regarded as a classic in Korea, and Hesse himself as a kind of visionary, because it's on the curriculum, it gets taught, and more importantly, students get tested on it. And growing up in the United States, I actually read Hesse in school myself, though it wasn't Damien, but Siddhartha, his novel about the life of the Buddha. And even that was the idiosyncratic choice of my teacher, not the requirement of any national curriculum.
Right. Even for me, growing up in the UK, I don't think I had heard of Hesse before coming to Korea.
Never once. I was curious about that.
But that might say more about me and my literary ignorance more than anything else. But I know there are other authors like that in Korea as well who seem particularly more popular and famous here than other places. Another example is the French science fiction writer Bernard Werber, who is
I was going to mention him.
Most famous in Korea for his book Empire of Ants. But yes, there's not a lot of his books even translated to English, so
and
it is
not
bizarre.
as big in France even.
Exactly, but many of his works have been translated into Korean. But yes, Demian by Hesse is particularly famous.
It's true, and I came to realize, as I spent longer living here, that the themes of Demian also have much in common with other Western works of narrative art that find appreciative audiences here. Take, for example, Luc Besson's film Léon, or Léon the Professional, about a middle-aged hitman who becomes a parental figure and mentor guide through a dangerous underworld to an orphaned 12-year-old girl, and even the object of her misdirected desire. Demian is built on a similar dynamic. In it, a middle-class adolescent boy named Émile Sinclair falls under the influence of a mysterious, strangely mature-seeming classmate named Max Demian, and in a way one can only describe as seductive, Demian challenges Émile to leave the sheltered world of illusion in which he'd grown up and enter the boundless reality outside it, a process illustrated by the symbol with which Hesse represents abraxas, that of a baby bird forcefully breaking out of its eggshell, out of the shell that contains it. And the protagonist of Registanks undergoes much the same process.
I see. So that brings us back to today's book then.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean we could approach this novel as a new version of Demian, a Demian for our time then?
On some level, it is a Demian of the 21st century, and also a Korean Demian. At the beginning of the novel, its protagonist, Gi-yoon, is an artist about to turn 30, struggling to explain the unconventional choices he's made in his personal and professional life to his parents and his friends. And this leads him into a reminiscence of his high school days, which takes up the rest of the book's 400 or so pages. Much like Émile Sinclair, the adolescent Gi-yoon lives in perpetual need of a mentor. At first, he seems to find one in a slightly more worldly classmate called Sang-min, with whom he makes an initial connection over their shared interest in Nike shoes and other branded apparel. But Sang-min turns out to be nothing more than a schoolyard hood and ultimately becomes an enemy. Thereupon arrives a transfer student named Min-jae, who carries himself as if he possesses the kind of knowledge for which Gi-yoon has always longed. He also carries around a book, and at all times as well, which I gather was an unusual habit for a Korean high school student in the mid-2000s. So when they get to talking, Min-jae asks Gi-yoon if he's read, of course, Demian, which he describes as his personal Gyeongjon, or scripture. Gi-yoon does what I think we've all done when somebody we admire says something like that. He lies and says he has read it, then immediately checks it out from the library. And soon, as he and Min-jae as they get to know each other, they become inseparable friends. Though their relationship always has something of the teacher and student about it. They may be peers, but like Max Demian, Min-jae simply has a superior grasp on the ways of the world, as evidenced by, among other things, his advice to Gi-yoon not to regard the girl on whom he has a crush as a Yoshin, or goddess.
Okay, so the book does directly reference Demian then.
It does.
So that and the high school setting of the book may be quite specifically Korean, but it sounds like the novel's central relationship would not be hard for readers from any country to understand. I think for many people, Min-jae is perhaps the kind of friend we'd all wished we'd had, no matter where or when we grew up.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but there were a few times back in school where I sure could have used the guidance of a Min-jae of my own, which I should emphasize is something very different from the guidance of a parent or a teacher. And in Registanks, as in Demian and many other Bildungsroman, adults want nothing more for the protagonist and his peers than to shape them to fit into the existing systems of society. To some extent, that holds true all over the world in reality, but here in Korea, those systems can be especially harsh toward those who don't conform. Yu represents that with the school Gi-yoon and Min-jae attend, their high school, whose restrictions on the students' appearance and behavior become draconian enough to inspire them to resistance, or rather a résistance, modeled directly on the underground operations that worked toward the liberation of Nazi-occupied France in World War II. And when their minor acts of rebellion grow more and more brazen, the administration eventually backs down, although due actually to non-violent action, not to non-aggressive action in the end, not to any of their sort of acts of what they call terror. And despite technically being a victory, this experience shakes Min-jae's equanimity. Even if you beat it, he reflects, does the system ever really change?
I see. So that's where the title of the novel comes in then. I was wondering about that, forming a resistance group against one school. That, I'm sure, would intrigue many younger readers. But as you said earlier, the author, Yi, tells a story through the memories of a man who is well into his adulthood. So is this book directed at adults or for younger readers?
I think of an essay I once read about Hermann Hesse that described him as having written stories that keep faith with the powerful emotions of adolescence, which most adults forget or outgrow. The ideal readers of his books, and those of Rezistanz, are adolescents of all ages, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Demian is hardly the only influence EU acknowledges in the text. He also name-checks Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, The Great Gatsby, Zorba the Greek, and several other titles that have changed the lives of those who encounter them at just the right age. And it may be cliched to speak of a book changing your life, or indeed of becoming yourself, but those are experiences this novel takes seriously, and ones it ultimately concludes that can only succeed through perpetual resistance, not just against the institutions, but against the assumptions, expectations, the structures, and even the gods that happen to rule over your particular time and place. Though when I think about it now, I realize this book also shows us you might not like what you find on the other side if you do break through them, but that's the only way you're going to become the person you want to be.
Well, it sounds like a very compelling book, and I would be very intrigued to see if it ever gets translated as well, as I'd be very curious to see how Western readers would respond to the story as well. We'll have to leave it there. Once again, it's called Lezistanks by EU, and that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, thank you for introducing us to this book, and we look forward to the next one. Till then, take care.
Take care, looking forward to it.
And that brings us to the end of another edition of Korea24. We'll be back with more news, views and reviews from Korea tomorrow. Till then, we hope you have a great day. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-won, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.